Be careful when you enter into Big Sky Country. You might just encounter some big mysteries. Thanks for stopping by. Tonight I will treat you to 5 supposed true stories dealing with cryptids and unknown entities. These stories may not have happened in Montana, but definitely could have. If you enjoy this episode, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe. Click the notification bell so you'll know when your next scare is ready. If you want your true story read on this channel, please send it to bigskymysteries@gmail.com. So, sit back, dig into your bucket of popcorn that may or may not contain a small but very hungry cryptid eagerly awaiting its meaty snack, and listen to some scary stories. Number 1. The Redwood Cabin by Kuro Kiryu-chan. I used to live in Japan, but recently moved to a town somewhere in America. At our town, there was a story going around that a cult had a cabin somewhere in the woods near our town, and that they were doing incantations, summoning spirits and specters, the usual paranormal stuff. Me and my friend Jack, who I had met when I first came to town, didn't really believe in the paranormal, so when we had an opportunity to do so, we would every so often camp near the section of where the cabin was rumored to be and search around for it. It didn't take long, since on our 5th time, we found where it was. The cabin was completely hideous. It was infested with cockroaches, spiders, and even some centipedes. The left side of the cabin was decayed slightly, and the right side had a bit of a termite problem. At first, it looked like any old run-down cabin. Then we took a second, much closer look. That was when a horrid stench hit us. It was horrible. I gagged and almost vomited. Even though I was busy dealing with the stench, Jack was able to get a look at the walls. They were covered with signs, up-down crosses, blood-red eyes, and the most frightening part, bodies of people, completely stripped of their clothing and nailed to the wall of the cabin. I thought of calling the police or running. Jack, however horrified he was, insisted on going into the cabin. "I'm not believing this. It's probably just some really good deco," he said. As reluctant as I was, I pushed onward, Jack leading with his flashlight. We opened the door slowly. That was when I couldn't take it anymore. I vomited onto the grass just to the left of the cabin. The reason I vomited was even worse than the stench outside. Just in the front door was a dead dog. It had been butchered and left to rot. Worse, it was a local dog that had went missing just 2 days before we found the cabin. Jack gently pushed the dog to the side so he can get inside. He waited a bit for me and we kept going. Inside was like the exterior, only exception was blood-red rooms replacing the bodies. We came into the main living room of the cabin. It had a big ritual circle. The walls were different too, this time now sporting words such as devil, the beast, our master, the end, and much more terrifying words, such as the runes in the eyes. It was blood red, except this time it seemed like there was real blood. That was when I figured out that the other drawings were simply dried and it didn't look as clear as these. The more I figured out, the worse I felt. If the others were dried, wouldn't that mean these were just made? That was when I had it. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to the cabin door, and what I saw, I can never unsee. A tall, slender figure covered in intestines, blood, organ, and everything gross and putrid. It was blocking the cabin door. That was when I screamed as loud as I could. I turned back to look at Jack. Though he still looked like Jack, the man I looked at was carrying a knife. He had a grin on his face, widening by the second. I backed away from him, but he grabbed my arm and dragged me closer. I struggled, trying to get away, but his grip was locked firmly. I watched in horror as the knife was raised. That was when I made a last-ditch effort. I kicked him in the forbidden zone, which worked, and I ran toward the direction of the door. That was when I bumped into the slender figure again. Now I couldn't make out its face, but what I saw was not human. It looked like the face of something out of the depths of hell itself. I shambled back a bit, then remembering Jack was there, I moved to the right. I found a window, the only window in the entire cabin. I tried and tried to open it, but it simply didn't budge. I turned back in shock as I realized this is how it was going to end. I was going to be murdered in some satanic cabin by my friend. I crouched down now in tears and closed my eyes. I waited for the knife to end it all. I waited, but eventually nothing happened. So I slowly opened my eyes and saw that it was daytime. Jack, or possessed Jack, had collapsed on the floor, still clenching the knife. The slender figure was gone. I tried the window again, and now that it was daytime, I saw that it was locked. I unlocked it and opened it up. How silly, I thought, that I didn't check for the lock. I made a mental note to always do that and then proceeded to exit via the window, carrying Jack through it first. I ran to our campsite, put Jack in his tent, and went into mine. I recapped what happened and then put this in my diary. Though this wasn't the nearest near-death experience I have ever had, it was definitely the most extreme and grotesque. I waited for Jack to wake up and then headed back to town with him. I never told anyone what had happened, and definitely didn't tell Jack, who is now my best friend of all time, that he almost killed me. Number 2. There was something knocking at my door. Submitted by Unique Individual 20. This happened about 2 years ago, nearing the end of September. My aunt and her friend decided to fly up to New York from Panama to enjoy their mini vacation with my parents and I. Although many strange and paranormal experiences have happened to me ever since I was little, this event stayed with me and affected me more than the other experiences. Here's the thing, many things have happened to a lot of my family members, especially my aunt and her friend. We'll get back to that later. So it is around 10:30 at night. Keep in mind that my old neighborhood was a very calm and quiet place. Since I live near the countryside, not much action happens in the neighborhood. The neighbors were either elderly or young couples with small children, none that could cause trouble around the neighborhood. There were only about 20 to 25 houses in the entire neighborhood I lived in. Moving on, the three of us decided to stay up late to watch scary movies while my parents slept upstairs in their room. My aunt's friend was sitting near the sliding doors leading to the backyard, while my aunt and I were sitting in the bigger couch near the front door. I was sitting on the left side where the door faced, and my aunt sat on the right side of me, which meant I was the closest to the front door. We spent about 10 minutes debating on which movie we should watch. After those 10 minutes, we finally chose to watch Odd Thomas, which wasn't really a scary movie, but was about a guy who could see spirits and demons. What a coincidence. We were only 2 minutes into the movie when I had a sudden urge to look at the door. I glanced back at my aunt and her friend, only to see them staring at the door as well. I looked back at the door for about 5 seconds, and then a loud bang came, and then another one following after, and then a third one. All 3 bangs came from the front door, almost as if 5 people had just body slammed into the door 3 times. I thought it was going to fly off its frame. My first instinct was to run to the kitchen and grab a knife, but as I was about to do that, my aunt grabbed me by my shirt and told me to stay down. As I looked to my right, I saw my aunt's friend with her knees to her chest, rocking herself back and forth while my aunt just kept her gaze toward the door. While all 3 of us kept our attention to the door, next to it there were 2 small rectangular windows on either side of the door. The right window had a small curtain, and the left side was being covered with a small decorative tree. The small curtain had a gap in between of it because it was glued onto the window from the top area to the bottom area, leaving the middle part loose. At the moment of the bangs, it caused the middle area of the curtain to puff slowly and then quickly press against the window, leaving it wrinkled. After that, we were all silent. All of us were terrified. My aunt denied being scared, but at the moment I could see nothing but fear in her face. I wanted to run upstairs to get my parents, but I was too afraid to go up the stairs because it was right in front of the door. All I could do was text and call them, but they were too deep in their slumber to hear their phones ring. My aunt told the 2 of us to calm down and dismissed it as the wind. We all knew it couldn't have been, but in order to stay calm, she made up that excuse, and I must say that it was totally cliché. The next morning, I told my mother about the previous events. She brushed it off by saying it must have been a bear or a deer, another cliché thing to say. We both went outside to inspect and found my mom's decorations near the front of the door thrown off to the side. There were no scratch marks or bumps on the door. Everything seemed normal except for her decorations lying on their side. When the 3 of us looked at the door the night of the event, there wasn't anything that would have caught our attention. Since the woods were 40 meters away from the house, We would have heard the trees moving with the wind, but we heard nothing. The movie was playing at the time, but it was strange how we all felt the sudden urge to look at the door, almost as if we knew that something was about to happen. The bangs were extremely loud and caused me to jump up from the couch. It couldn't have been kids playing a prank on us, because I'd been living there for about 3 years and nothing like that had ever happened. Plus, I knew the neighbors well enough to know they'd never do such a thing like that. There were exactly 3 bangs, one after the other one, and it honestly could have caused the door to fly out of place, but thank God it didn't. What about the curtain? The only explanation we could come up with was that the impact of the bangs created the wind, causing the curtain to react that way. But why did it inflate slowly if the bangs were rapid and then suddenly cause it to go against the window so fast after the bangs were over? My aunt thinks that the wind must have knocked off its course. That's why we didn't hear the trees moving, and created huge columns of wind that must have caused the door to move so much. The gust of wind must have gotten inside the house from the cracks of the door, leading the curtain to puff up. Personally, it doesn't make sense and sounds like total BS to me. She also mentioned she saw a shadow outside, but she doesn't have an explanation for that. I didn't see a shadow outside, though. My mother came up with an excuse as well. She said it might have been a deer or a bear, but why would a deer or a bear bang their head, or entire body for that matter, into the door? Like I previously said, there were no scratch marks to prove it was an animal, and no animal could have caused those 3 loud bangs. We've had deer sightings in that neighborhood before, but none that have acted in such a strange behavior. Usually they would all run back into the woods. Bears are out of the question. Not once have there been sightings of them. I should also mention that we had the lights from the outside on. Why would an animal come that close to a house, especially a door that is clearly being illuminated by a light? Like I said before, animals in general are out of the question. As I mentioned before, my aunt, along with my mother, have experienced many unexplained events, and they believe in the paranormal. I think the only reason they tried to make up an excuse for this situation was to prevent me from becoming paranoid and afraid. It's pretty late for that now, since I've had my share of experiences as well. Now to my aunt's friend. My aunt told me that when her friend was younger, she suffered from really bad night terrors. She said she saw things, demonic entities as she described them. She'd wake up screaming and crying. It was traumatizing for her. Her family had always been religious, and they prayed for her every night, and slowly those things haunting her went away as she grew up. That really creeped me out and led me to believe that she might have brought or attracted this thing to my house, or maybe it could have been something else. I hope this never happens to me again. Please let me know if you guys think it might have been the wind that could have caused those 3 extremely loud knocks at my door, or an animal, or some kind of creature. Number 3. The Thing Had My Grandmother's Face, submitted by Scary Stuff, Scary Stuff, Scary Stuff. So this is a little paranormal story I had back when I was just 12 years old. During the summer of my 7th grade year, me and my family decided to take a trip up to Alabama to visit my grandfather's estate. My grandfather had just recently passed away due to a massive heart attack. So unsurprisingly, my family was very distraught. My mother was will executor, so she was in charge of the estate and taking inventory of all my grandfather's belongings. As we pull up to the house, I get an eerie feeling. To give a little perspective on the setting, I will describe the house. The house is located in a whiter trash neighborhood filled with druggies and weirdos. A couple years after the visit, the house would be broken into and the copper from the wiring in the house would be stolen. So that gives kind of an idea of the scumbags my father had living around him. The house itself kind of looked like the house from the Amityville horror movie. It was 2 stories with a basement. It had 3 bedrooms and 2 baths at the top floor and 1 bedroom and 1 bath in the basement. It had wood floors and the ceiling was unpainted. The only place in the house where the ceilings were somewhat painted was in my grandparents' bedroom. It had an X pattern and a sequence of patterns across the ceiling. This bedroom was particularly big and had a bathroom in it. It is also the room my grandfather died in. My grandfather was 6'7" and 300 pounds, so I had guessed that was what had attributed to his heart attack. The house's exterior was made of wood and sat on 10 acres of land, another 100 acres if you count the land that was leased. The land was littered with old rusty cars that my grandfather used to collect parts off of. The inside of the house was rustic, and the furniture looked like it was bought from Goodwill. It smelled musty, a smell I can't really associate with too many other things. Just to be clear, I'm not knocking the house. My grandfather built the house with his bare hands, so I have a lot of respect for it. He and my grandmother had spent the first 3 years building the house and living in the basement. The basement, however, smelled even worse than the upstairs. It smelled like old, dead air. The kind of smell you would smell at an abandoned house in the middle of the woods. It had a kitchen, a living area, a bedroom, and a basement. I like to spend a lot of time down in the basement, snooping through a wide variety of items my grandfather had down here. From old radios to old police monitors, my grandfather had everything down here. On one particular day, my parents were outside taking inventory on the vast collection of mechanical parts, and I was snooping around in the basement. As I was down there, I started to hear noise above my head. It sounded like footsteps coming from my grandparents' bedroom. I figured it was one of my parents in there to get something. I shrugged it off and continued with my snooping. The sounds never went away, though. It sounded like a crescendo, starting off soft and gradually getting louder and then starting all over again. It sounded as if it were rocking back and forth. I decided to go up and investigate the noise, but no one was up there. I was creeped out, to say the least, so I joined my parents outside, where I stayed for the rest of the day. Fast forward to nighttime, and I was back in the house. I was forced to sleep in my grandparents' bedroom despite my protest. Luckily, I was sharing the room and the bed with my grandmother, who happened to join my parents on the trip. My parents would sleep across the hall. Me and my mom got in some sort of argument, and I was forced to go to bed early. I was in this creepy bedroom alone, while my grandmother was right outside the bedroom in the living room. She was watching TV. Despite the noise coming from the TV outside the bedroom was extremely quiet. It seemed to take on an aura of its own. The bed faces the door going out to the living room, and the bathroom door sat on the right side of the bed. So, here I was in this creepy bedroom laying on my back in bed. As I was laying there, I began thinking about the footsteps I had heard earlier in the day. Didn't like it in that bedroom. The air inside the room seemed suffocating. As I was laying in the bed, I heard a noise inside the bathroom. I lay there motionless with my head turned towards the bathroom. My eyes were locked on that closed door. This bathroom wasn't big at all. It was like the size of a storage closet. I will never forget the noise that I was hearing from that bathroom. It sounded like a gargling sound. It sounded like a choking, gargling sound. I really can't explain how scared I was. I just lay there, paralyzed with fear. Several seconds went by, although it felt like hours, before the sounds quit. It fell silent again, even more silent than before. I was still too scared to move. I wanted to scream out to my grandma, but I couldn't bring myself to do so. I rolled over on my side so I can permanently keep my eyes on that door. A few minutes went by before I started to notice something again. The door handle on the door was slowly moving from one side to the other, as if someone were trying to open it but couldn't bring themselves to do so. I just stared in complete horror. My mouth was hanging wide open. The latch on the door went through the stop, and the door began to creep open. It was an inward swinging wood-frame door, so it would be opening away from me. As the door began to open, all I could think was that I had to get out of there, but I couldn't bring myself to do so. The door opened about halfway before it had stopped abruptly. It was dark in the room, but the TV from the living room outside illuminated the room a little bit. The door opened about halfway before it stopped abruptly. It was dark in the room, but the TV from the living room outside illuminated the room a little bit. I could see a dark shadow moving around in the bathroom. I couldn't quite make out the shape of it. It looked eternally dark, sort of like a black hole of darkness. All of a sudden, a face popped out of that darkness. I was horrified. It was my deceased grandmother. Her head and face were showing, but not her body. It was almost as if she were peeking out at me. I was even more weirded out by how close to the floor her head was. It was about an inch underneath the door jamb. Her long, mullet-like gray hair hung to the side, and her thick seeing glasses just about covered her whole face. Words can't even begin to describe how terrified I was. I contemplated getting out of bed and running out of the room, but the thought of my grandmother reaching out, grabbing my leg, and pulling me to my doom quickly pushed this thought out of my mind. So I just laid there and stared at her. She stared back at me, and then she began to smile. Oh God, that smile. That smile let me know one thing. That wasn't my grandmother. I don't know who or what that thing was, but it wasn't my grandmother. That smile had dry, caked-on blood surrounding it. It was pure evil. The head began to move its way up, past the door jamb until it finally stopped at the top of the door, which had to be 7 feet high, its eyes never leaving mine. It began to creep its way from the side all the way to the middle of the doorway, its dark body just about covering the whole door. I couldn't stand any longer. I closed my eyes and screamed louder than I'd ever screamed before, over and over and over again. Finally, my dad burst through the doorway, followed by my mother and grandmother. A wave of panic filled their faces as they flicked on the light and looked at my face. I was pale white and staring into space. They began questioning me as to what was wrong, but I said nothing. Eventually, they calmed me down enough where I could finally tell them what happened. They first looked at each other and then back at me. I could tell they were skeptical, but scared at the same time. My father went and checked out the bathroom. Of course, there was nothing in it. My mother finally moved me out of the room into a different bedroom on the other side of the house. I never heard anything else about this incident from my parents. I'm not even sure they believe me. All I know is that writing about this 10 years later still gives me the creeps and sends chills down my spine. Probably because of one disturbing fact that I learned a couple of years later from the incident when the house finally sold. My grandmother didn't just die, she committed suicide in that very bedroom that I was staying in. A gunshot to the chest. I was very close to my grandmother, so I know that she wouldn't do anything to scare me like that. So whatever that thing was, I hope I never meet it again. After learning my grandmother's suicide and that demon I met in her bedroom, I eventually came to a revelation. I believe my grandfather had an unseen factor that contributed to his heart attack. That monster that I encountered in the bedroom is the culprit that had gone unnoticed, and ultimately led to my grandfather's demise. Number 4. May Ray's Flock Monster by Horror Mule 1 and May Ray. I've lived in a small rural town north of the States on the border of Canada for the majority of my life. Growing up, I had a friend named Mary, but her accent changed it to May Ray. Ironically enough, her family bred and sold sheep for a living. When we were old enough to wander into the meadows and play with the sheep, we often would do so, keeping our St. Bernards, Gus, and Goliath with us for safety. One early summer morning, a few weeks after the last lambing of the flock was finished, we set out to find and befriend the newest little one hidden away in a small wooded area at the back of her property. The sheep liked their privacy when they were lambing, but typically their privacy was an illusion due to the amount of predators in said woods waiting for them to single themselves out. We would sometimes find coyote or bobcat victims slaughtered and thrown about the paths, blood showered everywhere in the struggle. Rarely the killer would be something larger, probably a cougar, caching the newborn and the mother in trees. We would find it hanging there in the fork of the branches, wedged by its head and its stomach torn open with massive blood-soaked holes in its throat. On this day in particular, one of the two were still alive. We didn't know yet if it was the mother or the lamb, but we knew it was hurt badly. It was bleeding and screaming louder than we had ever heard. The dogs chased after the noise as we followed quickly to the site. I wish we hadn't. We found at first glance a fresh cougar kill, but something was off. The lamb lay wedged in the forks of limbs like always, dead as a doornail, blood gushing out of it and a fresh pool flooding the earth below. The mother was also wedged between some limbs, her horns keeping her from shaking loose, her back legs twisted at odd angles. On her exposed underbelly, just a few days shorn for a cleaner birth, was a deep, precise gash from her neck to her arse, then a horizontal cut from foreleg to foreleg with the corners of her shoulder flesh pulled and folded neatly, upward exposing the muscle. The intestines knotted with afterbirth twisting out of her belly, up around her neck, still having enough reach to almost touch the ground. Dogs were going haywire when I noticed there was virtually no blood anywhere else in the entire area. I looked back at the lamb to see its throat hadn't been punctured, nor was any part of it wounded, but there was fresh blood still gushing out of it. The neck was broken, hanging abnormally long and swinging eerily from the commotion of the dogs and mother rattling the trees. Mireille walked closer to the lamb, trying to see where the blood was coming from. From what we could tell, it wasn't coming from one place in particular. It was bleeding out of every single pore on its body, out of its ears, eyes, nose, and mouth as well. We stared, horrified and confused, about how the hell this could possibly happen when we heard distant yelping. snapping us off the attention of the lamb to see Gus and Goliath were gone, in pain somewhere in the distant woods, but not too far to run, so without thinking, we followed the noise to see. Gus motionless in a bloody pool and Goliath standing over him. Over Goliath, however, was something so horrifying I don't even know how to properly explain it. It was a red-brown, scab color, tall with long arms and huge claws that would compare to that of a bear. It looked starving. The head was like a deer, but longer, like an anteater with no ears and a mane like a horse's. But the hair was very thin and ragged. It stood on its hind legs that bent backwards awkwardly. It had to use the trees for support with one hand. The fingers, just as long, was the claws on the tips. The hands themselves would resemble a human hand with those origami claws on each finger. It was wheezing out of breath as if it had bronchitis or pneumonia. Goliath ran towards it and using its free hand, it grabbed him by the neck, lifting him easily off the ground, yelping. The hand clutching the tree slipped off casually, and the monster tossed its shoulder onto it, leaning on said tree. Then ran its claw gently down the dog, caressing it, stopping just below its neck, and plunged the tip of its nail in, the dog screaming horrified as it tore a surgical hole down his belly, then hung him on the limb as its head shot in our direction, turning to us as its dark hollow eyes narrowed. Frozen, we watched it take a step. It wheezed out a piercing wail like a wolf's howl mixed with nails on a chalkboard, mixed with the pained screams of a rabbit emitted out of its small hole of a mouth. Then I blacked out. I woke up at home with Mayray, not knowing what happened. Most of my memory would return later, but what happened after that thing turned towards us would need to be told to me by Mayray. Apparently we ran and hid, with it chasing us all over through the woods until we hit the edge. Then it stopped. We continued running until we got to her house. Crying, we tore open the door to her house and then to her room, and then I fainted on her floor, exhausted. She tried explaining to her parents, but they didn't believe the story, said it was a bear or something. Mourned the loss of the dogs, then began building a large fence a few weeks later. It's been a few years and neither of us know what it was. It didn't resemble the behavior or look of a Wendigo or a rake very well, but we both remember the experience vividly. Number 5. The Creature That Almost Caught Us by the Chainsaw Killer. This happened directly to me. At the time of the story, I was a 12-year-old male who lived in California. For a summer trip, me and my family flew to Boise, Idaho for a week to stay with cousins. We stayed at their house for 2 days, and then came the best part. It was the best part, until what happened, that is. On the 3rd day, we drove to a small city in the Rocky Mountains of central Idaho. They owned a cabin in Ketchum. The first day was fishing at nearby lakes, playing games, and meeting a few of the neighbors on the small street. Everyone we met was nice. It was amazing. I thought nothing could go wrong. Before I say more, here's a layout of the area. The room where I slept was at the back of the house. There was no fence at the back of the backyard because it was on the bank of a freezing cold river. Directly on the other side of the river was a huge mountain covered by a thick forest of pine trees. A small path starts out on the other side of the river, but there's no bridge. There is one, a quarter of a mile down the road in front of our house. I went to bed that night. I woke up at 2 a.m. needing to use the bathroom. I got up and did my thing, then headed back to my room. As I got into bed, I felt hot, so I opened my window. Not 15 minutes after I opened my window, I heard the most terrifying screech come from the forest. It was raspy but high-pitched. I know for a fact it wasn't human. I've heard stories from horror narrators on YouTube channels that often describe creatures that make weird noises that sound sort of human but aren't. I heard it once more, but this time closer. In the morning when I woke up, we explored around town. At 7 p.m., me, my sister, and my cousins got permission from our parents to go explore the forest. It was uneasy considering I had heard creepy, human-like noises in the night, and it was nearing night. The oldest cousin, Alex, who was 16, took a loaded pistol, a lighter, and a backpack full of snacks. I carried a hunting knife and a flashlight. The cousin my age, Julia, took just a flashlight. My sister Brianna and the other cousin, Karina, who were 10, took some extra batteries and a small bag of candy each. We made our way across the bridge at the end of the street and back to the path on the side of the river across from the house. All of us began the hike to the top of the mountains. We made it to the top of Bald Mountain in an hour and a half. The view from 9,000 feet was incredible. At 8:55, Alex and I figured it was time to head down and ordered the group to the path. At this point, it was dark now and the sun had fully set. Julia and I turned on our flashlights and shined them ahead as we walked. Some halfway down the mountain, which was about 45 minutes into the walk, I got the dreadful feeling you get when you're being watched and followed. Seconds later, something that was hiding in the bushes a few yards into the tree line that bordered the path ran off on our right. I brushed it off as some type of small animal. About 5 minutes after the incident, what we heard made me tingle with fear and my heart dropped to my stomach. That same horrifying screech from last night echoed through the forest from a mile or two away. I told everyone we needed to move faster, and we did. It went off again, but closer. Again, closer. Whatever that thing was, it was moving faster than us. We were full-on speed walking by then. That still wasn't fast enough because soon the screeching stopped, and we heard loud steps 30 yards off to the right. I got that feeling of being watched again. Alex took his gun and fired 2 shots in the general direction of the steps. The creature backed off, but even though we thought he was gone, I still sensed we were being watched. As the river came into sight, it caught me and everyone else by surprise. I heard the path gravel crunching behind us. I looked back, and in the darkness, I saw the outline of something that resembled a human on the path behind us, with about 200 yards of distance between us. I told Alex, and his face went pale when he looked. We told the rest of the group quietly, and on 3, we all broke out into a run towards the river. Whatever that thing was, it was extremely fast. When we reached the river, there wasn't time to get to the bridge a quarter of a mile farther along the river because this thing was catching up fast. We jumped in and swam across the ice-cold water. It got to the river just as we made it to the bank and into the backyard. Julia and I shined our flashlights and finally got a good look at it. It was a massive, hairy creature that was about 7 feet tall. It had huge, razor-sharp claws like a bear's. Its eyes glowed red when the flashlight shined on them. Alex shot at it, and it darted off with one final screech. We all looked at each other in pure terror, shock, and surprise. Alex explained everything to our parents. They didn't know what to make of it and had never heard of anything like it. I'm thankful nothing happened to us and that I noticed the creature behind us. If I hadn't, one of the others might not have noticed it until it was too late. The next time I stay at that cabin, I am not going alone into those woods at night.
Thanks for joining me at Big Sky Mysteries. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button and click the notification bell to get your next fix of scary stories. Send your scary true stories to bigskymysteries@gmail.com to have them read on this channel. Remember, that noise outside your window in the middle of the night may just be a stray cat prowling, but it may also be a creepy cryptid looking to pay you a midnight visit. Or maybe it's some other big sky mystery. Good night.